Welcome to Behind the Book. It's time now for Behind the Book, hosted by Tess Thompson and Karen McQuestion, two authors with a passion for books, no filters, and limitless curiosity. Join them now to find out the real story behind your favorite books and authors. And now, Behind the Book.
Welcome to another episode of Behind the Book. I'm here with my bestie, Karen. How's it going?
It's going well, but I have a question for you.
Okay.
I have heard you use the word bestie for more than one person. And I'm wondering how that works in your brain. Can you have multiple besties?
I personally think you can, and I'll tell you why. Because you're my author bestie. Like, that's our thing together. Like, that's our world that we share and that we understand each other really well because of it. Whereas I have my bestie here in town who I've known forever. We raised our kids together. You know, she's like a sister. So that's a different, but she doesn't know anything about writing or isn't interested at all, you know. So to me, there's like
categories.
Yeah.
So I could be like your podcast bestie.
So you're multiple besties because you're my podcast bestie and you're my author bestie.
Okay. That I can accept that. I just wondered, I thought, how loosely does she throw this term around? You know?
Pretty loosely. Yeah.
So I feel special, but maybe not as much as I did before.
Yeah, but nobody else is doing a podcast with me. So, you know, you still got that.
I've got that. We'll always have Paris.
That's right. Exactly. Well, we had an amazing guest on today, and I'm a huge fan of her work and the podcast, Six Figure Authors. I was really sad when they decided not to do it anymore, but I do understand, and I'm appreciative of the years of advice that they gave us. But she was on my bucket list to get on here because I really wanted to meet her and ask her some more questions about her. You know, she just had a lot of knowledge about indie publishing.
Well, not only that, but the Six Figure Authors podcast still exists. And they have, I believe it's 127 episodes. So if anyone wants to go in, and a lot of that information, I would say most of the information is still relevant.
Yeah, well, and sometimes they interviewed other authors, and then sometimes they would just answer questions from their, their author group. And so, yeah, and they did a really good job of describing, here's what's in this episode, so that you can kind of go through and say, oh, that looks like something I would like to learn about.
It was funny because so much of what she said resonated with me. She said she cut out gluten and dairy and had, her health had improved, which was the case for me. And we got started in self-publishing around the same time. She talked about being an introvert and loving working from home. And so I was like, wow, we have a lot in common. And then what happens after we finish the interview? The two of you decide you're going to become
besties.
Your local author bestie, because she's going to be moving closer to you, and you're making plans to go out for some wine thing. And I'm like, I guess Lindsay and I aren't going to be best friends. I stabbed her.
Well, she's moving to Woodinville, which is the suburb next to mine. And of course, we spend a lot of time up there because Cliff and I love wine and everything. I knew she was living in Oregon because of her podcast. And of course, I'm from Oregon. So I was always curious which part where she was. And so I was glad to find out that it was Bend.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll fly in and join you guys. What do you think of that?
I was going to say, you're welcome anytime.
I just might do that.
Well, I would love it if you and Greg would come out and show you around. But anyway, we'll let everybody enjoy Lindsay's interview and enjoy the show. Today, we are so excited to have Lindsay Buroker on with us. I am a huge fan of both her work and her previous podcast. She is a full-time independent fantasy and science fiction author who loves travel, hiking, tennis, and vizslas. She's written over 60 novels, appeared on the USA Today bestseller list, and has been twice nominated for a Goodreads Readers Choice Award. She grew up in Seattle, but has itchy feet and moves every couple of years. She's currently in Bend, Oregon, and working on the next book. Welcome.
Thank you. And that's a type of dog, in case anybody doesn't know. Okay, so like vizslas, is that like chocolate or what?
No, I'm glad you said that because I figured because I follow you that I know you're a dog lover, but it's good to let people know. So tell us a little bit about your path to publication. Did you always want to be a novelist?
My mom taught me to read at a really young age, so I was always reading. I was an only child, so I had books for my little friends after everybody else had to go home for the night. And so I was always reading, making up stories in my head. It did take me quite a while to get to the point where I liked writing, but I never finished things. I have like all these stories, from handwritten days on that wide ruled paper, more than wide ruled paper you get as a kid. But I was always kind of told growing up that you should get a degree in computer science or business, something that actually makes money, because authors do not make money. So I had that in my head, but I always loved it. I loved reading, and I wanted to, every time I'm reading a book, and this is still true today, even more so probably, my mind starts wandering and I like adapt the story or start thinking of other stories from that. So I kind of did it off and on. And then probably in my late 20s, I got a little more serious. I thought, well, why not? And I joined an online writing workshop. They're still around, I believe, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Online Writing Workshop. And then you posted a chapter. You could have like 3 chapters up at a time, and you critique other people and they critique you. And I would see some of the people that I critiqued were selling their stories or getting an agent. And I thought, well, that's kind of motivating. I'm probably not horrible. Like they can do it. Maybe I could do it. And so that kind of gave me the drive to actually finish a couple of novels. They weren't in the same series because the advice then was, don't write in the same series in case you can't sell the first one. This was probably like 2007, 2008. So a little bit before e-reading was taking off. And but it was 2010 when I had things ready, and I'm like, okay, I got to query agents, which I was dreading because every time I went to an agent's page, they said, like, we don't want any of that Tolkien-inspired Dungeons and Dragons kind of fantasy. And that was what I loved to write. I just high fantasy, otherworld stuff. I grew up just devouring all those novels. And so I started querying, but at the same time, I'd gotten my first Kindle. This was like fall 2010. And then I found J.A. Conrad's blog, and he was a author that early days we all found him. He was like, I made 100,000 this month on Amazon. And I was like, I'll make that in a year. So that was very inspiring. Of course, he had like 80 novels and had come out of traditional publishing. But I thought, well, if I could do some of that, that'd be kind of cool. And so by the time, maybe like a month or two later, I just fully got, I'd read everything I could. I found K-Boards back then, the Writers Cafe, which still exists, but is not really the hangout anymore for authors. But it was back then. And I just jumped in, which is funny. I actually got an email back from one of the agents like, oh, I want to represent you, as I was like formatting my novel to put on Smashwords, because that was the only distributor back then. And you could only upload direct to Amazon and Smashwords. And I was sitting there like, oh my gosh, I've paid for the cover art and the edit. What do I do? And I decided to just go forward, and no regrets. I think looking back, of course, I'm doing this full time now and I make a nice living from my books. So don't regret that. And then also, I don't know if I have the patience for the traditional route. Like I have friends that got accepted, by an agent and shot the book around for 2 years, and they didn't get published, or they got published and it was sort of like they didn't really get any marketing put behind them, so their book just didn't sell very much. And at least now, this way it's completely in my hands. So if something bombs, oh well, that was on me. So it seems to suit me.
So if someone's not familiar with your books, which one would you suggest they start with?
So I jump around sci-fi and fantasy. So if you're kind of a space opera fan, my Star Kingdom series is pretty popular with the readers. If you're more high fantasy, my Dragon Blood series has been my biggest seller over the years. And then if you prefer contemporary fantasy, Death Before Dragons is my urban fantasy that's done pretty well for they're all kind of different styles. I kind of do whatever the genre convention is, like first person for the urban fantasy and then third for the high fantasy and space opera. So whatever floats your boats. I have so much stuff out that it's like, well, what do you like? Unless you hate fantasy and sci-fi, then I can't help you.
Have you been able to tell if the readers cross over in those genres, or is it kind of mysterious to you?
I definitely have some readers who are very amazing people who seem to like my quirky sense of humor and will read anything I put out. And it impresses me because there's no author in existence where I've read 100 books by them, although there aren't many authors that have written that many. So it's like, I might if they had that many. But yeah, and then there are certainly the people that only want the sci-fi. It's usually the guys that are like, oh, why are you writing these dragons and magic and junk when you're going to do the next in the Star Kingdom series? So it's a little bit of both.
So what do you think drew you to fantasy and science fiction? Sounds like you were always a fan. What is it about those subgenres that you love?
A little bit is actually my mom, who is very eclectic in her TV viewing taste. She's very mystery thriller when she reads, but she'll watch anything where she likes the characters and the camaraderie. So I remember watching the original Star Trek reruns as a kid with her, and Buck Rogers and some of the other sci-fi. And then I kind of found fantasy more in middle school on my own. There was this cover with this guy with these two swords on climbing a gate. I was like, what is this? This looks kind of interesting. That it was R.A. Salvatore's Drist books, in case anybody's wondering. So that got me into fantasy. And then a lot of it was too just being a little bit of a weird, awkward child, introvert. I always connected more with like Mr. Spock, the kind of analyzing humans and finding them very weird. So I don't know. I just always kind of connected with the characters you sometimes found in sci-fi and fantasy. And the idea of just a made-up world seemed, especially these days, it seems kind of more appealing sometimes than what's going on in our own world.
So when you do read, well, first I should ask, do you read while you're working on a novel? And when you do read, who are your favorite authors?
I often will not read too much when I'm working on a project, just because my brain's usually dead by the end of the day. And it's like, I can't look at a screen. Everything's on a screen these days. So maybe it'd be different if I actually got some paperbacks and just kind of did that. But sometimes I'd listen to audiobooks, but I often take like a week off between projects. And right now I'm trying I think it's a fantasy romance series. I've been going through those lately. But my favorite authors, I feel like the authors I found as a kid or, teenager, early 20s are sort of the ones that stick in my mind still as my favorites. Like I often forget stuff I read now. It's just like, who was that author? I don't know. I have to go back and find it on the Kindle. It's not that they're not great. It's just, I think the stuff you enjoy when you're younger, it just really makes an impression on you more than when you're older. So Lois McMaster Bujold is my favorite for sci-fi. And then I loved like David Eddings and Raymond Feist. In fantasy, they both had especially David Eddings, he had my kind of snarky humor. His characters were always like dry and snarky. So I miss him. He's passed on. That's the problem when you get older. These people that you enjoyed growing up, you're like, oh, they're not here anymore. That's sad. They're not going to write any more books.
At what point did you become a full-time writer? Like how many years did it take between like putting out those first couple books and now?
It actually only took probably about 2 years. I think it was about the sixth and seventh books in my Emperor's Edge series were like a part 1 and part 2. And I remember I published those and I kind of hit a goal like for basically more than I was making before for my full-time income. And I was like, wow, if I could just not fall below this certain level for a while, maybe I could do this full-time. And that was 2012. And because I was self-employed and I had websites and made income from affiliate marketing and AdSense on my websites, it wasn't like the old income went away right away. Eventually, it definitely dropped off after I completely started ignoring it in favor of writing. But so it wasn't as hard a transition for me as people that have like a regular day job and have to decide, hey, boss, I'm going to quit. So yeah, it was about 2012 though when I kind of got to the point where I was making more consistently month after month from my books.
So you were kind of an entrepreneur even prior to becoming an author, it sounds like.
As much as you can be as an introvert, I'm super thankful all the time for the internet because I could never sell my books at conventions and like bookstores. I'd be so horrified if I had to get in front of a crowd and try to, oh, this is great. Let me read to you from this book. Kudos to the authors that do that. I've never done it. And I'm just horrified by the very thought of it. I actually had some health stuff going on and a lot of carpal tunnel syndrome kind of stuff. So that was what drove me back in the early 2000s to try to figure out how can I make money from home and not having to pound at the keys for 40 hours a week. Because I was actually working on a computer science degree at the time. And then I shifted to like cultural literature and arts because I was like had a vague notion I might have to teach or something like that. Tip for anybody listening, I went gluten-free and dairy-free after finding out I was quite sensitive to those. And that helped tons with a lot of the inflammation and issues. But basically that was what
That's
motivated me
interesting.
I was like, oh, Google AdSense was this new thing. And back then there weren't very many websites out there on content. So I would just get books from the library and like turn them into, take 3 sources and write, like here, I did home improvement was sort of the industry I got into just because I was a big fan of like HGTV and all that stuff. So that was how I first made money online. Did that for almost 10 years, I guess, before transitioning to the book stuff.
I mean, when you were talking about when you first got in, you mentioned 2012 and even prior to that, we have that in common because I started in 2009 uploading on Kindle and then it went off progressively. That was sort of the self-publishing gold rush. At the time, did you feel like you were on the cusp of a sea change in publishing?
I think I was very excited that, everything was kind of going online in the Kindle. Like I'd been waiting for like at least 10 or 15 years for e-readers because I remember you'd get an ebook back in the day and it was a PDF that you read on your computer. I was like, what? Why is this taking so long? Like it seemed like I was so waiting for, the e-readers to come along. But it wasn't really a gold rush for me in that I didn't know enough what I was doing with the cover art. And I knew nothing about like writing a blurb to market or like what would appeal to people. Like I thought my stories that if I could get them in people's hands, they would like them and continue on. Because that was the feedback I got from my critique buddies in the workshops. So like, oh, these are really fun. We like the characters and the banter. But that took a while to figure that out. And I eventually got all new covers for that series. But the first covers were very not epic fantasy. It's just, I found the one guy, like there was like 2 guys at the time that did cover art for self-publishers. And there were no editors. I had to just go and look. I think somebody on Kboards that was how I met the editor I'm now using. But for the first book, it was I want to say a teacher or something like that, just doing it on the side, not really like an experienced editor. So I was kind of stumbling in those early days, trying to find people to even make your book because I had no skills in cover art or graphic design. So it really took me a while to get going. I was definitely not a overnight success. I put my first book out and was trying to bribe people, please go buy my book. I'll buy yours if you buy mine. It'll be great. We'll just boost the Amazon algorithms and then we'll sell tons. And oddly, this did not work and was borderline not ethical looking back on it. But you're
Desperate times.
You're desperate when you're new. So I did, understand that at the time there were not yet a lot of the backlist books in ebooks, so there was a lot less competition. So I definitely saw that. Like I understood why the people like Amanda Hawking back in the day with her whole bunch of, I guess you'd call them paranormal romances for 99 cents. I got why she did well. Like I understood that. And gradually over the years, I kind of learned. But I did learn how to make my book free when I put my third one out. And that was sort of the thing that just kind of got things rolling. Like I said, I believed that if I could get my books in the hands of people, they would, it would stick. And they did. That first series was very much, a lot of the fans I have now came through that first series, and they often say, oh, that's still my favorite. So I'm not sure what that says about what I'm writing these days, but
I know that I just did a survey with my readers, and they were saying they liked the first series. I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm so much better now. What are you guys talking about?
Well, and it was true too. Like I'll go back to the first one and and you can all authors do that. Like your first one, even though that wasn't the first novel I ever wrote, is the first one I published, and it's a little rougher around the edges than these days. I think I've improved a little bit, but I understand the characters did connect with people, and I do have other series that some readers prefer. So it's not like everybody just prefers that first one. But I'm glad it really helped. It helped make my career.
So you mentioned that you like the indie model as a writer and as a career. What do you think are the qualities an author needs to be successful in the indie world?
I think it's a little bit of being consistent, just putting books out over time and accepting that it takes a while to build a fan base. And then a little bit, you have to be a little, I'm going to say self-aware, maybe a little self-critical, able to kind of analyze, like if something didn't work out, and not just go, but I have a 4.5 rating average. I don't understand why I'm not selling tons. Maybe you have to look a little deeper. Like is there something in the reviews where some people were not happy with the protagonist is too whiny, or just find the clues. And I think critique workshops are a good idea. Not everybody agrees with that, but I feel like because there's a lot of advice from your peers, not necessarily like people that are super experienced in the industry, and you can get some stupid advice, like take every adverb out of your writing and stuff like that. But usually if you kind of go through that process, you become a little more confident in yourself and you find your own voice and your way, and you start to learn like which criticism is good, like it's legitimate, and maybe I should address those things. And which stuff is like, I like that adverb, I'm keeping that adverb. I felt that was helpful. So just, a combination of accepting it's probably your first book is not going to be a bestseller that makes your career, and just decide if you want a career. Do you have a whole series and more series in you? Like when I got started, I knew I had a series in me. I might not have known I was going to write 100 novels, but you never know. If you're the kind of person that always has ideas, it's probably a sign that maybe you're meant to do this. If you can write something that you don't necessarily have to write to market or write a bestseller that millions of people are going to love, but it has to be. Sometimes I see this stuff people write and it's not selling. I'm like, that's really out there. And I'm talking as a sci-fi and fantasy person. Your first person present tense, mole. Not to say that animal stories can't work. I forget what that's called. I remember the Redwall books. I totally read this as a kid growing up. But, sometimes it's a little too obscure. Like there's probably a niche out there for you, but if it's only 3 other people in it, it's going to be tough. It's going to be easier if it's a little bigger than that.
So at this point, having written so many books, would you ever consider publishing with a traditional publisher?
It would have to be sort of the right circumstances. I would. Because it'd be kind of cool to have like a movie done and some stuff that it's not as likely to come your way if you're self-publishing and just unless you're some absolute rock star who's always at the top of the charts. So that would be kind of interesting, but I think it would have to be something where I wrote a new trilogy or something like that for them. I'm not too interested in giving up the rights to any of the existing worlds where I have 8 or 10 books or more. And that also all those backlist books that I've written over the years contribute to my income today. So I'd hate to take them down for a maybe. It's hard to say if they would take off just because a traditional publisher took them on.
What made you decide to set up a Patreon account, and how does that work?
So my Patreon is basically just they get the novels 1 to 2 weeks before I publish them, and also the audiobooks at the higher tier. And it's mainly because I started launching series exclusive with Amazon, probably 2017 or something, maybe 2016. And it was just because Amazon was already 80-90% of my income. So I was like, let's just go on. And I found out that I made more by being exclusive and in the Kindle Unlimited and everything. But so Patreon is a way for me to continue to get the books out to everyone that wants them, whether they're, Kobo, Barnes & Noble. I use BookFunnel to put them out there. So any e-reader will work with them. And so because I put them out early, they're not yet exclusive. So I wait till I put them out to those guys. And then a couple of weeks later, I publish them on Amazon and click the box. So it was a way to try to make both camps happy. It's kind of a small portion of my income, but it is also kind of nice because it's something I could rely on if ever anything happened. Like you hear these horror stories of people getting booted from Amazon or just, it's nice to know here's these people that I could just quickly ramp that up and get more people onto that or try a Kickstarter or something like that if I had to. So it's nice. And those tend to be like the hardcore fans that are willing to, they pay every time I put out something new, sci-fi, fantasy, whatever. So those are the ones that are willing to pay their $5 or $10. I've even got a few people at $25, even though I say like, don't do that, guys. I have more like do it once if you want to throw in a tip jar kind of thing. But I've got a few people that do that. So that was sort of the main reason.
That's actually genius. I don't know why that never occurred to me to do it that way. Because I recently put all my series in KU and, I'm still kind of learning that because it's a lot. It's really different than being wide. But like you, I had so much more success with it. I thought, I think I'm going to go all in, but it scares me to death. And I do feel bad about, the readers that prefer Nook or Apple or Kobo. So
one thing I will warn people of, if they're going to do Patreon, like I very much set it up intentionally so it wasn't any extra work other than uploading the BookFunnel. So they're willing to pay to get it early. You don't necessarily like, I'll see people do Patreon and they have to do a short story every month or something. And for some people that's fine, but there was no way I was going to do that. I find that I write so much and that it's just almost easier for me to do a novel, or it's not that much harder to do a novel than a short story because I'm not that great at coming up with short stories. They always turn into like 30,000 words. So I wouldn't want that extra commitment to do all that extra stuff. So just be careful anybody that's thinking of doing that. You might want to try a Kickstarter first because that's a one-time commitment, and see how much you enjoy all the extra stuff that goes into that beyond just uploading your book to the stores and announcing it.
Yeah, interesting.
And Lindsay, I'm asking on behalf of all our listeners who've heard 100 books and they're wondering, how do you do it? What's your process?
Well, like I was saying before, I kind of gradually worked up to that. My first few novels were probably about 6 months apart. It took me to publish, and they were longer, over 100,000 words. But so my process is kind of streamlined at this point. I scribble down ideas in my notes app on my phone, very high tech. I might be a month ahead of time. I'm kind of scribbling down ideas. Then when I'm ready to start the novel, outline it. That usually takes a day or so. Then I get started writing. I'll do the first draft. If it's like I just finished one that's about 80,000 words, and that was 2 to 3 weeks of writing, not every day. And then that one was actually pretty quick. An editing pass, that one less than a week. And then I send it off to my beta readers. And while they have it, I'm now scribbling down ideas that I'm going to outline and then start writing book 2. They'll send it back and I will incorporate any feedback I agreed with and then do another editing pass and then send it off to my editor. And she's doing the copy editing kind of stuff. And I'll be back working on this next book. And then she'll send it back. And then I accept the changes, send it off to typo hunters. Usually by the time it's ready to publish, I've gotten the next novel written, edited, and it's going off to beta readers. So it's sort of I don't want to call myself a factory, but an assembly line or something. It is very much a process that's always ongoing unless I do something really odd, like take a vacation, which I'm not good at taking home vacations, staycations. If I'm home, I'm probably working. I might only take a day or two off before jumping on the next thing. I'll go read some book by an author that's not me, and then I'm ready to go on the next thing. So sometimes I have to book myself some kind of travel adventure to actually get out of that mindset of work. Being a workaholic can help, but I hear there are downsides too.
Yeah, so I've heard. All right. So for a long time, you were one of the co-hosts of a very popular podcast called Six Figure Authors. I was a huge fan, and actually I learned so much from you guys. Like I loved every single episode. How did that get started? What was the impetus for that?
Well, I'm glad you found it helpful. That's nice to hear. Joe and I had done another podcast with Jeff Poole for several years before that, sci-fi and fantasy marketing podcast. And I got to the point where I didn't want to do it every week because, you guys know, there's a little more to it than just the time you're recording. You got to get the show notes, you got to get it published and out there. And we always tried to make it almost like a lesson. So we'd put together pretty extensive documents of notes beforehand. So we really wanted to make it useful information. And so it was just every week, it's like, I have to do this again. And it didn't really, like a lot of podcasters, they're doing a nonfiction podcast and it ties into courses or books that they sell. So it really makes a lot of sense. It's like lead generation for them. And I won't say that nobody ever bought my books after listening to the podcast. There have been a few people that said they did, but we were talking about publishing and stuff, not like sci-fi and fantasy. So it wasn't a very natural, like, doing this every week makes a huge difference as far as my publication of novels and how many books I sell. So it was kind of easy to let it go when it just started to become, each week you're like, I don't want to do this. So it was sort of fun while we all chatted, but then there's a little extra work that goes into it.
Yeah, and like you said, you guys really had lesson plans for each episode. And I remember thinking, God, this must be a lot of work for them to have to go through each week and do this. So yeah, I can sympathize why you guys had to let it go, but I also miss it, just for the record.
Is there a writing book that you'd recommend to maybe someone just starting out?
So I was big into the workshops and I kind of learned the ropes that way by being critiqued by other people and critiquing others. So I don't have a bunch of, I think I tried to read Stephen King's On Writing and I don't think I finished it. It was a little rambly. I was listening to the audiobook. Audiobooks are hard because if something's kind of slow, it's doubly slow in audiobook. So no, other than I actually found Strunk and White really useful because I never had grammar in school other than like the 1 week we diagrammed sentences in 7th grade or something. So that one was very useful. I will say probably a grammar book of some kind if you're not already super up on that stuff. Because I have a friend that's an editor, one of my beta readers, and I hear like the manuscript she gets. I'm like, why do these people not think they need to learn how to write before? Like maybe there's always some stuff. Like I always have to look up who and whom and a few things. But the more you know, the cleaner a manuscript you can send to your editor, the less you're going to pay as a self-published author. And if you want to get published traditionally, you need to have a really rock solid manuscript that goes off to the agent. So it's just really worth having, spending the time to learn how to use the semicolons and commas and the good stuff. Don't dangle your participles. So that's probably a good, unless, some people are already rock stars at that stuff, but a lot of writers are not. We're more like, we just want to tell the story. We just like the creative. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's good to be practical. Like I said, you'll spend less on editing. Most editors, it's kind of like how many hours they spend on the manuscript is what they're going to bill you for.
So this seems redundant after you guys did a podcast for 2 years, but do you have any marketing tips for authors?
I would just say
that's a big question, I know.
I think the big one, and what I found continues to work, what worked for me was the first thing that worked and still works to some extent, is being willing to give away free stuff. And even writing stuff, knowing you're going to make it free, bonuses for the website or your mailing list, having a book one in a series free, maybe after you've got a few books out in it. I just found it's much easier as someone who doesn't like to push their stuff ever. I was always much more comfortable, like, hey, this is free if you want to try it. You didn't lose anything if you don't like it. Whereas I feel less comfortable saying, hey, this is $5 if you want to try it. If you don't like it, there's your $5. It went away. I found that super helpful, being willing to put out free stuff. And then I think a lot of people they'll grab it, at least try a couple pages. Usually I would, because I've heard a lot of authors say like, oh, that doesn't work at all. I've tried that. People are freebie hunters. They just stack them on their Kindle and never read them. And often when I've gone and looked at their free thing, I'm kind of like, yeah, I bet they did try it. They only made it a couple paragraphs in and bailed on it. And that's why you didn't see it improve the sell-through of your series. So if you are going to do free, it should be like as amazing as you can make it. Whether it's a short story or a novella, I always like it to have a plan. Don't just throw out something free that doesn't tie into anything else. That's probably not going to sell any books. But if it's a book one or like a prequel novella, and people are getting a taste of these fun characters that have great banter, or you're just really great at plots or fight scenes or whatever your special talent is, then you probably will sell books for you as long as you're able to move copies. And the promos are generally pretty inexpensive for, Fussy Librarian and some of those sites like that. You can at least get some eyeballs on it and get a feel of like, yeah, this is working. I got a couple more extra sales on book 2 that way. The days of probably BookBub giving away 50,000 copies for you may be gone. But if you just have the mindset of gradually each month, maybe do something, try to push that free thing to more readers. Maybe you get a new reader every month, and over time it builds up.
So it sounds like you use the rapid release model of publishing. How far apart do you space the books in your series? And why do you think that's such an effective strategy?
So yes, I do this on some series, especially like I'm actually going to do this on the urban fantasy I have coming up, where they're shorter books. When I did my epic fantasy, there was no way. They're 150 to 200,000 words each. I was not going to sit on even as a fast writer, it takes a long time to write 3 of those. So I usually only recommend this for someone who is fairly fast writer and probably who's already been through it, has done a series or at least a few books, and you have more of an idea of what sells and whether it's worth investing the time up front to write 3 or 4 novels before committing. That's a big commitment. And like if it's your first series ever and you don't know if people are going to like it and go on from book 1 to 2, 3, 4, then maybe it's probably not a good time to do it. Or again, if it's going to take a year to write 3 novels, which is perfectly reasonable. A lot of people only write a novel a year and work a full-time job and have a family and everything. So don't feel bad if this is not for you. But for those people that can write pretty quickly, it can be pretty powerful. I generally will write the first 3 and be working on 4 with the process I talked about before. as I'm releasing them. And it's maybe books 1 and 2 might be 2 weeks apart, book 3 maybe a month after that. And I'll do the pre-order so that I can grab people as soon as they finish the previous one. And the reasons why, here's my list. First thing, it's sort of a momentum thing. Like, it's never going to be easier to sell book 2 than right after the reader finishes book 1. You're probably going to throw everything you can into launching that book 1. And chances are it's probably never going to sell better than it does at the launch. That's not necessarily true for everyone, especially if you have a dud of a launch. Maybe you get a book out later and it does better. But let's just assume that you're putting everything you can into the launch, and book 1 is going to rocket up the chart. You're going to be in your top 100 for your subcategory or the whole store if you're amazing. I'm not that amazing. And you're going to have the most people buying book 1. And if they can go right on to buy book 2, it's an easy decision for them if they liked book 1. And then if you've got book 3 coming out again, hey, order that sucker too while you're at it. So maybe you have a couple months where everything's selling well and you have like 3 books in the top 100 of urban fantasy or whatever your subgenre is. More people are just going to notice, like, wow, that author's got 3 books. I definitely need to check out that author. And also from a monetary standpoint, like, I often, when I'm going to launch a new series, I think it's going to be 6 or 8 books, I'll often launch book 1 at 99 cents just so I can get the most people I can. Even to 99, I've just had more success at 99 cents. It's so easy for people to just grab it, especially if you're not in Kindle Unlimited. Like, if you are wide and they're going to have to pony up money for every installment in your series, that's a bigger decision for people. 99 cents is very easy for people to just jump right in and try it. But it's hard for you as an author, though, if you just spent $2,000 on cover art and editing to only get 30 cents per book. But it's easier if you have book 2 coming right out behind it, and maybe that's $3.99 or $4.99. And so you get the money from both of them basically at the same time. So that helps take the sting out of launching one at 99 cents. And I will often make that book 1 later on, $2.99 or something like that, or $3.99, and then kind of price pulse and go back and forth and run sales on it for 99 cents again. And that way I don't have to feel bad too. Like, when I do a launch and the book is at $2.99 or $3.99 or $4.99, I'm not going to drop it to 99 cents for a while, at least a year, probably till the series is out. Because I don't ever want people to feel bad that they paid full price for something. I'll see authors do that. They're like, oh, shoot, this thing's not selling. I'm going to drop it to 99 cents. But you just sold it to a bunch of people at $3.99. So that's pretty crummy. But if you do it later, people expect older books to go on sale. So it's not that big of a deal. One more reason is that I've definitely found by doing bundles of 3 books, like 1, 2, 3 in a box set, that if I can get people to read the first 3 books, they're going to be way more hooked and probably going to read the rest of the series. Versus if they read 1 book, maybe they're into it, maybe they're not. And when some of these voracious readers read a book a day, they're so easy to forget an author after 1 book. You're just going through reading all the fantasy romances out there or the romantic comedies out there, and they start to mesh together. But if an author, if they decided, I'll buy book 2 and 3 because they're already available, then by the time they've read 3 books by you, they might remember your name or your series name. These are good things. The more you're in people's heads, the more they're going to remember you, buy more of your books, and of course, recommend them to their friends, which is my favorite kind of marketing. That happens when I do nothing and spend nothing. The last reason I like to do the rapid release is, as a fantasy and sci-fi person, I often have a lot of world building. And so it's very typical for me to be working on book 2 or 3 and think of ideas that more things I want to add to the world, or something fun for the side character's background. And I'll go back because I haven't published book 1 yet, so I can go back and tinker a little bit if I want to change something up. Whereas if you've published book 1 and a bunch of people have already read it, you're probably not going to change it. You probably shouldn't. So that's fun too. That's another reason I like doing it. But overall, just the momentum is sort of a strategy as far as marketing and getting in people's heads. And you make more money in a chunk. It's kind of nice than when it trickles in. So I guess those are my reasons.
All right. How about this? Is there a book you're dying to write but haven't yet?
Not really. I'm not one of those people who had some super epic, scary novel. I've definitely heard of authors that do that. They don't feel they're ready to write it yet. I'll just write anything. For the most part, my ideas are not too epic and scary, so I feel I can tackle them. I am going to do a new Star Kingdom one. I've been not putting that off, but writing easier stuff. Those are pretty also 150,000 words. So sometimes those ones that are a little longer, I have to work myself up to a little bit more. I need to write a couple easy things first. So, but not in general, no like secret to meaning of life story that I'm waiting to write.
I'm curious, do you have a lot of readers that contact you wanting more books in a specific series?
Yes.
Ah.
Or you'll like post this lovely Facebook post. Oh, I got the new one coming out in this series I'm working on. And they're like, when are you going to do a new one? And when are they going to have babies from your first series? And I'm thinking this character to grandpa. I'm like, I'm probably never going to write that. What do I say? But yeah, you have people, and I'm the same way with my favorite authors. I always want to pester. I mentioned Lois McMaster Bujold. Come on, do some more Vorkosigan books. Stop writing fantasy. And it's like, of course, author can write whatever.
Well,
they
that
want.
actually reminded me of my question, which is, do you have a number of books in a series that you think is like the perfect number? Like, is it 6 or 20 or, or do you just go series by series?
I seem to have a lot that end up in the sort of 6 to 9 or 6 or 8. I have a lot at 8, and I don't recommend 8 because they don't box into trilogies very easily. If you do 9, you can have 3 box sets of 3. But that seems to be about the length I like to write. I never kudos to anybody that writes 20 books in a series, especially if they're selling well. Why wouldn't you keep writing them? But I almost always write in an arc where there's some big bad that they got to eventually deal with at the end. And so once that's done, it's a little challenging to continue writing more in the series. I am going to make an exception for my Star Kingdom series. I just love those characters so much that I'm going back to write another one with all the characters from the original series. I was going to do a spinoff, and then the original characters came and inserted themselves so much into the spinoff book. I should have just written this about them. But in most cases, that's about where I feel I've told the story, and people are probably tired of the characters. I don't know. For people who do, I feel like the PI kind of books, certain kinds of series lend themselves well to just continuing on. Like that's their life. They solve a new mystery every book. They just get older over time, hopefully. And it works really well with that. So if you do those kind of almost standalones where you can just keep going and they're selling well, go for it. But that seems to not be so much my type.
Hey, you talked about book covers and how in the early days you didn't have a lot of choices in book cover designers. How do you do that now? Do you have one person you work with who designs them for you, or can you tell them what you want?
Yeah, I've found a few people that are really good. I have one guy that's great for sort of the epic fantasy and the space opera. He builds a model spaceship and puts it on each one, and they're really great covers. And I love those because you don't have to worry about what the characters look like. You're just like, here's the spaceship, and there's a battle going on in space. So space offers some of the easiest covers if as long as you get a good illustrator. For urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy, I've done a mix. I did a series I found the guy on Fiverr. Actually I found him. I was stalking other authors on Amazon. And I was like, I like this style. And then I found out he was on Fiverr. So I did him I didn't do him, but you know what I mean. So definitely those are like the Photoshop manipulation covers where they're just grabbing models. You see the same guy on lots of different covers, like, oh, he's a great fantasy hero. Oh, look, he's on this romance novel too with his shirt off. And then I also have done some where I spend more and I get a custom photo shoot done. Like I get to pick the models. That's kind of find somebody as much as you can in New York in the model scene, find somebody that fits your hero, which can be hard if you're writing fantasy or you want anybody that's not like young and beautiful. But, and that's fun because then you get an original model that's not on all the other covers and he does an illustrated background. So those are great. But I will say one of my best-selling series were just the very inexpensive Photoshop manipulation covers that are, I'll say $200 to $300, which is not super inexpensive for everybody. And you can also find ready-made covers for less than that. But I've spent lots more, like over $1,000 on some illustrations and also on the model where they do a photo shoot and everything and pay the model. So those are more expensive. And those are fun. And it's a bit of an author pride thing, but not necessary. You don't have to do that. Like I said, some of my best-selling series have been some of the least expensive covers.
Now that intrigues me. How does one, say you wanted to hire a model, how do you go about that?
You have to find somebody that's their thing. The guy I've used is Gene Mullica, and he's done a number of traditional, like he came out of working with traditional publishing. He did the Iron Druid books. And if you look through his gallery, if you're a fantasy sci-fi person, you definitely recognize a lot of the covers. And so he does that. He's in New York. He's got an assistant too, and they're great. They know the models. They're like, here, you give them a description, and then they have like 10 people that might fit, and you pick the one you want, and they book everything, do the photo shoot. And then he does the illustration too. So if you want like a dragon in the background, you can get a dragon, even though it was an actual person in the foreground. So, I mean, maybe the dragon's real too. You never know. It's New York.
That's right. How consumed are you with the story when you're in the middle of writing a book?
I'm pretty dedicated to it. That's one of the reasons I like to write quickly, and I hardly take any days off if I can while I'm writing the rough draft, because I'll just sort of have this movie going in my head and I'll get very into it. And I'm often like, even when I'm walking the dogs or something, I'll scribble notes on the notes app, the high tech thing on the phone, and run into a branch or something while I'm doing it. So that's why I said I don't often read a lot of other stuff while because I'm just very into my story. And then once I take a break before the editing, then I can read somebody else's book and be happy. But yeah, I am definitely.
Is there something you wish people knew about being an author? Any misconceptions you'd love to clear up?
You guys probably know these too. So many people, I think they want to write a book and they want it to become a bestseller, and it's like a lottery ticket. It's just like, oh, well, I'm probably just going to make a few $1 million and be able to retire. And that does not happen for very many people. I'm not sure how, I'm sure there are some every now and then, but it's really, if you are drawn to being an author as a career, you're just replacing one job for another, but it's a job where you get to pick the hours, work from home. It's great if that suits you. Some people are horrified by the idea of like working alone at home for hours a day. And like, this is paradise. What else would you want to do? You want to be in a cubicle and talk to people? What? So you probably have to have the mentality a little bit, and that sounds exciting to you. But if you don't have more than one book in you, I don't know. I mean, you certainly could still write your book, but it's probably not going to be the lottery ticket. You just accept that. You can write your book, put it out there, say your thing, and you can do what you can to market it. But it's very rare for one book to continue selling well, even for a month, much less 10 years. Of course, there are the ones that we read in school that became the classics that continue to sell, but there are not many books like that, especially now. There's so many people publishing these days I would say Amazon especially, they're into the churn. Like it's super impressive when I see somebody that manages to stay on the top of the charts. And I always wonder, how much are they spending on advertising? Because Amazon seems to prefer to show you new books each time you go shopping for books. Some of the other stores, it seems maybe a little easier to stick for longer. But even then, I feel like they're in the business of presenting new books to readers when they come. So they don't want to necessarily have somebody, especially a voracious reader who's already read all those books that's in the top 100, see the same stuff every time. So you have to accept that you're going to have to keep writing books if you want this to be your career. And it's probably going to be like any other career where, maybe you have some good months, maybe you have some leaner months. And when you have the good months, just set the money aside under the assumption that it won't keep coming in indefinitely. So that's not very romantic, but that's probably how it is.
Are you working on anything right now that you could share with us, or is it a secret?
No, I have no secrets. I never know what to put on Facebook, so I share snippets of what I'm working on and talk about stuff. So I'm finishing up the epic fantasy series. It's a 6-book series, Dragon Gate. And that last one is coming out, I don't know, it might be out by the time your podcast publishes, the end of September. And then I'm working on an urban fantasy series that's a spin-off of my other urban fantasy series, Death Before Dragons. That was 9 books. I don't know how many this one will be yet. Probably 6 at least. That's how the last one started, 6, and then I wrote 3 more, as one does. So that's the current. This is the easier, lighter, more fluffy project after this is almost 200,000 words book. So taking a lighter fall.
Well, this is the part of the podcast where we ask our fun extra questions. The first question is, what is one food that will never get past your lips?
Sushi. Nothing raw, essentially, nothing raw. It's a texture thing. I'm sure it tastes lovely to people that are into that.
Who would you want to play you in a movie?
I don't have an answer for this one. Can you a movie about a writer? How boring would that be? That there'd have to be, unless it's Misery, and there's a cabin
I
and
was just gonna
somebody's
say.
like stalking and killing you. But then it becomes a little more exciting than my life than I want it to be. So I got nobody.
Nobody. What superpower would you pick given the opportunity?
I would love to have perfect health, not have to care. Superpower of like perfect health. Yeah,
That's a good one. What's your biggest guilty pleasure?
margaritas.
What is the worst job you've ever had?
I worked fast food for only a few months, Wendy's, and it was just because it was on my feet all day, and I've got flat feet. The Army was also torture. Basic training, you're standing all day, standing or walking, and the days are long. So for someone with flat feet, I was just in tears. I was just like, torture.
If you could instantly become an expert in something, what would it be?
Rocket science. Oh my gosh, you guys, when I listen to Elon Musk's interviews, I was like, I want to know all these things so I can write better science fiction. That would be amazing. But at the same time, I don't have the patience to actually go and learn all that stuff. I listen to some podcasts and try to get the gist so I'm not totally ignorant writing science fiction, but I would love to just magically know all that stuff.
What's your favorite smell?
Eucalyptus.
What is the most terrifying thing you've ever done?
I think I forgot to answer this one.
Oh,
Honestly, just the times I've almost died from when you're driving and something freakish happens. Like I think I had mud splatter my windshield once when I was driving at 60, 70 miles an hour over a pass. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to die, until the wiper blades went. And that was terrifying though, because you couldn't see anything. Things that happened to me, not of my own planning, are the scariest things.
So what's one thing you're really bad at?
Parking. I have a lazy eye, so I don't have the same depth perception that normal people have. So if I have to back into a parking spot, or in the Army, I had a 5-ton with a trailer that I had to back into this. That would be my hell, would be just doing that, having to back a trailer into a parking spot over and over again. So horrible at anything that requires a lot of depth perception.
Hopefully you won't go to hell. So
Not. All
Yeah.
good authors go to heaven, right?
that's right. If you could live your life over again, would you want to?
Is it the same life, or do I get to do new?
Whatever you want.
I have to, if I could do new things, sure. I've already
Okay.
done the things I've done. So it's like reading an old book. Maybe there's some parts where you reread it, but mostly you just skip all the boring stuff and read your favorite scenes. So
Mhm.
I don't know.
that's good. Well, this has been fantastic. We really appreciate your time, and we'll let you know when it's on the air.
All right.
Thanks so much,
Appreciate it.
Lindsay.
I will share it out to the interwebs. What do you call it? The socials?
I like the interwebs. That's
We'll go with
really
that.
Start using
All
it.
right.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for listening to Behind the Book, brought to you by authors Tess Thompson and Karen McQuestion. They hope you found it entertaining and informative. If you loved it, tell your friends. And if you have a moment, they'd love for you to post a star rating or review. This has been Behind the Book.